The first image that comes to mind shocks, like a sudden blast of reality. The island of Okinawa, scoured by artillery and smoke, stood as a living testament to war's final, furious chapter. People who saw it said it looked like a different planet, a planet stripped of civilization by relentless bombardment and desperate defense. Okinawa was not just another battle for territory or pride. It became a mirror held up to the leaders of nations, reflecting the human price of a full invasion of Japan and forcing impossible calculations that would resonate for decades. To understand Okinawa's significance, we must first see where it sat on the map. The island sits only a few hundred miles from mainland Japan and functions as a natural stepping stone for invading forces attempting to reach the home islands. Commanders on both sides recognized that controlling Okinawa would give strategic access, logistical staging, and crucial airfields to project power across the East China Sea and toward Tokyo. Geography shaped strategy, and strategy shaped suffering in ways that commanders could not entirely predict. For planners in Washington and Tokyo, the island was a pivot, a place whose control could determine the shape and duration of the final campaign. Okinawa's importance was not merely military, it was logistical and psychological as well. Capturing the island meant securing air bases within bomber range of the Japanese mainland and providing anchor points for naval operations and supply lines. The presence of Allied airfields on Okinawa would also reduce reliance on long-range staging and increase sortie frequency against industrial and military targets inside Japan. Psychologically, control of Okinawa would signal an imminent capability to invade the home islands. And for Allied planners, that looming capability forced a re-examination of all available options. The island became an unavoidable chess piece in a broader strategic endgame that would determine the final cost of victory. The Japanese defense on Okinawa was determined, organized, and deadly in its resolve. Commanders had prepared heavily fortified positions in the island's rugged interior, turning caves and ridgelines into near impenetrable networks of resistance. These preparations turned every square mile into a potential killing ground, prolonging the battle and increasing casualties among attackers and defenders alike. The Japanese strategy relied on attrition and tenacity rather than open maneuvers, and this approach made the fighting uniquely brutal. For the Allied forces, every advance became costly, measured in lives and time that altered the calculus of what would come next. On the American side, the invasion plan reflected years of hard-won amphibious doctrine and overwhelming firepower. Allied commanders planned to use naval bombardment, air superiority, and massed infantry assaults to seize key positions and establish airfields quickly. They expected resistance, but the scale of tenacity and the unique terrain stretched even the most confident planners beyond anticipated limits. This confrontation of doctrine with reality revealed the cruel limits of military planning when faced with an enemy who refused to surrender territory easily. For many soldiers in the field, the map became meaningless compared to the visceral reality of hand-to-hand, hillside, and tunnel combat. Civilians on Okinawa found themselves trapped between two iron wills, and their suffering was rarely incidental. Over 100,000 Okinawan civilians would die between bombardment, battlefield crossfire, and forced evacuations, making the island's civilian death toll one of the highest in the Pacific theater. Entire villages disappeared and memories of family culture and daily life were swept away in months of devastation. Their suffering complicated both military action and post-war reconciliation, as occupying forces and the Japanese government later had to grapple with the trauma inflicted upon non-combatants. The human cost added moral weight to strategic decisions that extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives. The casualty figures for Okinawa shocked military planners and political leaders alike into a grim reassessment. American casualties numbered tens of thousands when considering killed, wounded, and missing, while Japanese military deaths were far higher and many more civilians perished than most had predicted. This brutal attrition undermined any comfortable assumptions about a rapid or cheap path to victory on the mainland. These figures were not abstract numbers for leaders weighing the future of the Pacific War. They translated directly into mental images and worst-case scenarios about what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would demand in terms of blood and resources. Kamikaze attacks, unleashed on Allied naval forces during Okinawa, introduced a new dimension of psychological warfare and maritime peril. hundreds of suicide attacks targeted carriers, transports, and support vessels, inflicting disproportionate damage and deepening naval commanders' fears. The destructive carelessness of these missions demonstrated a determined willingness by parts of Japan to accept enormous losses for strategic effect. The kamikaze campaign forced Allied naval doctrine to adapt rapidly and instilled a sense of unpredictability into every naval operation around the island. This unpredictability magnified the estimated cost of any potential invasion of Japan and fed into broader strategic calculations in Washington. As the island war ground on the American military began to confront the unthinkable alternative, if Okinawa, a single island, required such horrific expenditure of men and material, what would a full-scale invasion of Honshu or Kyushu look like in human terms? Planners projected casualties that might reach into the hundreds of thousands for attackers alone, and possibly millions when including defenders and civilians, numbers that made political leaders uneasy and morally burdened. Those projections reframed the conversation about ending the war rapidly and with minimal Allied losses, and they created an opening for any technology or tactic that could promise to avert an even greater slaughter. Okinawa therefore moved from a local contest to a catalyst for global decisions about weapons and legitimacy. Decision-makers in Washington were not immune to the emotional weight of Okinawa's carnage. When assessing alternatives, political leaders and military advisors discussed the possibility of forcing Japan's surrender without invading the home islands, weighing blockade, bombardment, and new technologies. Each option carried trade-offs and ethical questions, but few could dismiss the visceral imagery and casualty figures returned from Okinawa. For President Truman and his advisors, the island became another stark data point that elevated urgency and shaped the moral calculus surrounding the nascent atomic option. The memory of Okinawa's slaughter made the prospect of alternative measures seem more attractive from a numerical cost-benefit perspective. The timing of Okinawa coincided with the final stages of the Manhattan Project and a fraught diplomatic landscape. Scientists, military officials, and politicians were aware that atomic bombs might be available to force a dramatic resolution to the war, and Okinawa's human toll intensified discussions about using this unprecedented weapon. The convergence of battlefield data and technological readiness created a rare moment where an entirely new form of warfare seemed politically actionable. That convergence did not erase ethical concerns, but it added weight to arguments favoring demonstration or direct use to prevent further mass casualties. Okinawa's example was often invoked in internal debates as evidence of the high alternative costs of continued conventional operations. Allied planners projected that invasion of Japan would involve amphibious landings on multiple islands and a sustained campaign potentially lasting months to years. These predictions rested on intelligence gathered from battles like Okinawa, and commanders increasingly saw staggering scenarios of attrition. For those responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers, these predictions created a moral imperative to seek alternatives to direct invasion. In public and private, these estimates fueled pressure to end the war decisively, and they increased receptiveness to any option that promised to avoid the worst projections. Okinawa thus served as a grim test case for the human cost of continued conventional warfare against a resolute adversary. Within weeks of Okinawa's fiercest fighting, Allied leaders met to consider diplomatic and military strategies for ending the war. The Potsdam Conference and parallel diplomatic efforts took place under the pall of Okinawa's casualty reports, and the urgency to compel surrender without further decimation was a recurrent theme. Messages to Tokyo, demands for unconditional surrender, and threats of prompt and utter destruction took on different tones after seeing what Okinawa had become. Okinawa made abstract speeches about unconditional surrender feel immediate and forced, because leaders could imagine the same scenes in Japanese cities and countryside. That imagination altered rhetoric and hardened resolve among those who believed that only catastrophically persuasive action could end the war swiftly. Atomic proponents argued that a single decisive demonstration or weapon use could compel Japanese surrender and spare millions of lives that an invasion might consume. Okinawa strengthened this argument because it provided a recent raw example of the price exacted by conventional assault. Advocates emphasized that nuclear weapons, ghastly as they were, promised to avert a greater scale of slaughter on battlefields, like Okinawa multiplied across all of Japan's opponents, including some scientists and military officers pushed back with moral, legal, and long-term political objections. Yet even their critiques had to contend with the visceral images of Okinawa, making consensus difficult and the decision more emotionally charged than purely strategic. Beyond immediate military calculations, Okinawa shaped the post-war political landscape for both Japan and the United States in profound ways. For Japan, the island's devastation and the subsequent surrender catalyzed a long period of occupation, reconstruction, and introspection about militarism and national identity. Okinawa's civilians faced not only physical rebuilding, but also the complicated legacy of being a strategic pawn in greater geopolitical games. For America, Okinawa highlighted the limits of conventional warfare and the emergence of technologies that rewrote strategic calculus. The island experience contributed to a shift toward power projection via nuclear deterrence, and it influenced how military and political leaders approached future conflicts in Asia and beyond. The immediate consequences for Japan were catastrophic in human and institutional terms. The destruction of Okinawa was a precursor to broader collapse, and the surrender that followed ended a militaristic trajectory that had cost millions of lives across Asia. Occupation brought reforms, trials, and a pacifist constitution, but it also enforced a reality where Okinawa's people would face American bases and military presence for decades. That duality relief at the end of war, coupled with long-term loss of autonomy, remains central to Okinawa's modern history. Islanders reconcile survival with sacrifice, while negotiating the presence of foreign power on their soil. The consequences for America stretched beyond immediate casualties and into the country's moral self-image and strategic doctrine. Military planners vindicated the value of minimizing Allied casualties, but political leaders also had to justify the means used to achieve those ends to a skeptical world. The decision to use atomic bombs, influenced in part by Okinawa, therefore became a centerpiece in debates about proportionality, necessity, and the ethics of total war. American society wrestled with pride in victory and unease about the methods employed, and this tension laid groundwork for what would become the Cold War. Okinawa's lessons were folded into a larger lesson about power's responsibilities and temptations. The long shadow of Okinawa extended into the Cold War and the arrangement of military bases in the Pacific. The island's strategic value did not end with World War II, and in the decades after the war, Okinawa hosted significant American military infrastructure that became points of tension. Local protests, political debates, and recurrent incidents ensured that Okinawa remained a focal point for questions about sovereignty, security, and the human costs of hosting foreign forces. That continuity shows how a single battle can reshape geography, politics, and culture for generations. Okinawa's wartime trauma converted into a post-war strategic reality that both nations had to manage and justify. Memory and memorialization on Okinawa tell a complex story of suffering, remembrance, and reconciliation. Memorials and museums across the island preserve the names and faces of the fallen, and local ceremonies keep alive histories that are not easily encapsulated by national narratives. These sites insist that the staggering toll of battle be remembered not as abstractions, but as individual lives interrupted and communities transformed. This human-centric remembering complicates any easy justification of grand strategy because it foregrounds lived experience. The island's cultural institutions demand that future generations reckon honestly with what war does to society and to small communities caught in global conflict. Okinawa's legacy also appears in literature, film, and scholarship that probe the ethics of wartime decisions. Historians continue to parse how casualty reports, battlefield images, and strategic forecasts influenced policymakers in 1945 cultural producers. From filmmakers to novelists have kept the island's stories alive through personal narratives that resist simplified accounts of victory or necessity. This ongoing engagement shows that Okinawa remains a living subject of debate rather than a closed chapter. Its lessons feed modern discussions about proportionality, civilian protection, and the responsibilities of power. In a strategic sense, Okinawa taught the world that proximity to a target often dwarfs raw industrial capacity. The island demonstrated how staging grounds amplify the lethality of a campaign and influence the perceived viability of alternate weapons and tactics. That lesson shaped post-war doctrines about forward positioning and the importance of geography in an era where technological reach was expanding rapidly. Military professionals studying Okinawa concluded that theaters matter when weighing the costs of war, and that conclusion remains relevant across modern conflict zones. The island's geography will be studied for decades as a case study in how terrain influences decision-making. The psychological effect of Okinawa on both civilians and soldiers cannot be overstated in historical memory. Soldiers returned home with stories of brutal close combat, death in caves, and the faces of children caught in crossfire, and those stories influenced public sentiment. Families and communities absorbed these narratives and reframed expectations about how future wars should be fought and how quickly they should be ended. These psychological scars also shaped political attitudes toward reconstruction, veterans' care, and the use of overwhelming force. In many ways, Okinawa was a crucible where the human cost of strategic decisions was made acute and unavoidable. For Japan, Okinawa became an emblem of loss that complicated national memory and identity in the post-war era. The devastation and subsequent occupation brought questions of responsibility and victimhood into a complex negotiation. While national narratives focused on broader suffering across the empire, Okinawa's specific trauma demanded attention and sometimes clashed with centralized storytelling about the war and its aftermath. Local identity movements and Okinawan activists often pushed back against being subsumed into wider narratives and insisted on telling their own histories. This insistence has important implications for how nations remember and commemorate collective traumas. The military and political lessons of Okinawa also influenced American strategic thinking about force posture in Asia during the Cold War. The island showed the value of forward bases and the risks they carry in terms of local resentment and potential for escalation. Planners learned both the tactical benefits and the political costs of stationing large contingents abroad, lessons that echoed during later conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. These lessons inform negotiations, basing agreements, and the calculus behind projecting power while attempting to maintain legitimacy and local consent. Okinawa's experience was thus not just historical, but a continuing case study for strategic planners. We must also consider the moral legacy that Okinawa leaves for contemporary military ethics and international law. The battle highlighted the catastrophic consequences of total war tactics and blurred lines between combatants and civilians. International legal frameworks and humanitarian norms that developed after World War II owe their intensity in part to witnessing such large-scale civilian suffering on islands like Okinawa. Modern debates about rules of engagement, proportionality, and civilian protection still draw upon lessons learned at the end of World War II. Okinawa therefore remains relevant when discussing how to prevent future tragedies and how to hold actors accountable for wartime conduct. When we put Okinawa into a global perspective, we confront the paradox of technological progress and human vulnerability. The same era that produced incredible industrial capacity and the atomic bomb also produced battlefields of intimate brutality, where ordinary people were instantly vulnerable. Okinawa's significance lies in this paradox, where technology promised to shorten conflict while geography and determined resistance prolonged suffering in unpredictable ways. This paradox continues to inform contemporary debates about autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, and the ethics of long-range strike capabilities. Okinawa reminds us that new tools change calculations but rarely remove the ethical dimensions of violence. The final philosophical twist of Okinawa is that it teaches us about the currency of human life in strategic decision. Making leaders in 1945 used casualty estimates and battlefield horror as metrics to compare courses of action, and those metrics shaped one of history's most consequential choices. This uncomfortable truth does not absolve anyone, but instead asks us to recognize how decision-making sometimes reduces people to numbers and probabilities. Understanding Okinawa requires empathy for those reduced to statistics and seriousness about the systems that produce those calculations. The island's legacy compels us to treat human lives as more than inputs into strategic formulas and to modernize ethical frameworks accordingly. As we close this narrative, we must return to the island and the people who endure its memory each day. Okinawa is not simply a historical footnote but continues to host grieving families, active protests, and complex geopolitical negotiations about basing and security. Its landscape still bears scars. Its museums still teach painful lessons, and its people still ask questions about sovereignty and dignity. If this story shifted your thinking even a little, then the island has done its work across time, reminding us that history's decisions ripple forward and demand sustained reflection. Consider subscribing for more deep dives into historical turning points and their modern consequences. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us on Okinawa's significance in shaping the end of World War II. If this gave you a new perspective on the cost of war and the difficult choices leaders face, please subscribe and share this story with others who care about history. History can be a compass if we learn from it honestly, and Okinawa remains one of those essential, difficult lessons.